So I just had an opening today, and so I'm fascinated. I'm an experiential person, so I'm fascinated to run this work through my own system to understand it experientially. But I'm curious about your perspective on the need for consciousness of what's actually being processed, or if that's not necessary in this practice. Does that make sense?
Do you mean the need for, when you said consciousness, need for understanding?
For understanding, or what we would call like integration, that's a more intellectual, this is a very intuitive, non-rational process, but the intellectual understanding of it. For me, in my work, it's blending of the two that feels like it helps people evolve, but this is a different approach. So I'm curious about how important you feel conscious understanding of what the trauma is that's being processed is. Is that helpful, or is it unnecessary?
First of all, and before I continue, I disagree that this is all based on intuitive approach. No. It incorporates here every facet of an integral spiritual approach. Every facet. To begin with, the discourses here formed a part of that intellectual inquiry, positioning ourselves properly in terms of the philosophical orientation of a certain system, which is not just like something that I've invented, which is very important, which is time-tested. And not only that, it's time-tested whilst at the very same time it is continuously enriched because of the nature of that. Because this is very important. Like when people say, I want to study Tantra, it's impossible. Why? Because Tantra is not something that can be studied. Tantra itself doesn't mean anything. It's a methodology. It's how to. Nobody studies how to. So, fine. More specifically, someone says, I want to study Kashmir Shaivism. How can one study, let's say, and the Kashmir Shaivism has only a few distinctive doctrines, that's what they're known for, distinctive ones. Each has a set of scriptural revelations, like the path of direct recognition, as the aforementioned Pratyabhijna Hridayam, the path of vibration, right? The path of Spanda, the doctrine of Spanda, the doctrine of Krama. In fact, we can even narrow it down to just 3. Usually, but if you are interested, there is a Tantra Today. I don't know how many of you are familiar. It's a free online offering. There is a clear exposition on all this. So one cannot study Pratyabhijna. It's impossible. How can one study recognition without actually recognizing that what one studies? So one will become, just as what in conversations, the modern quantum physicist Menas Kafatos, with whom I shared panel on Kashmir Shaivism many years ago with Sally Kempton, myself and Menas, facilitated by Rick Archer, one of the science on duality. Menas said it's the contemporary science in a big mess, because on one hand it's like a train, it's like if you don't walk away, it'll run you over. It has this set of what, On the other hand, everyone understands that the paradigm of observe and observed is no longer working unless everything is ignored what happened in the 20th century. It's unignorable. Modern science is inseparable from all that what happened to it. Inseparable. So just as one cannot observe anything anymore without influencing that what is being observed, one cannot study this. And this can be extended to, of course, like one can't study Sufism. Of course one can, but one cannot. One can study Sufism, but one cannot become a Sufi. One can go and lecture about Sufism, but it will never be taken seriously by anyone. So therefore, there is this interesting phenomena that was among the intellectuals and educated of Europe, when they all were secretly converted into Sufi path because there was a living master at the time in Morocco, a greatly enlightened master, not known to anyone, but people who knew, seek his company, forsaken their cultural belonging, became sheikhs in their own right. Like Titus Burckhardt, who authored books on the history of art. He's the father of the great, also his father was already a great art historian. I forgot his name. Jacob Burckhardt, thank you. Yes, Jacob Burckhardt was already. And Titus Burckhardt was his son. When you read about him, and more than just, he was initiated. He became secretly following the Sufi path and rose to the status of the sheikh, master in his own right. So can't study really. You become what you study. So this is why I already disagree that this is only intuitive. This is not. It incorporates and contains everything. But you are right. Certain emphasis is made on something. Often at the expense of emphasizing something else. And as I would like you to maybe elaborate more what you mean in your question, I can already detect that what reminds me certain conversations that took place some years ago, and certain, let's say, emphasis that I have witnessed. For example, right now, trauma is that leading kind of conversation, right? Gabor Mater, Peter Levin has been around for a long time. So it's Gabor Mater, but only now Gabor Mater rose to the prominence. You know, I've met him many years ago. Nobody knew him. He was already doing this work. But in the last few years, he suddenly seems to be really, really gaining the momentum. This, what's his name? Joe Dispenza, right? It's all tailoring to trauma because it draws crowds. We all feel traumatized. It draws large crowds. Before that, if you remember, just before that, not just before that, 10 years ago, shadow work was very, very popular. Shadow work, a lot of shadow work. If that's what you're asking, then yes, of course. There's an emphasis is made here in favor of that, where I want the awareness with crystal clarity to go, rather than going and start digging in that what belongs to waste. It may has its, and I mean shadow work, like diamond approach. A.H. Almaas I've met him, I had wonderful conversations. I've met him over the years, but in Italy we actually shared a meal and talked about it. I openly disagree with that approach. And also on the account of working with people who have been in diamond approach for decades, not year, 2, 3, 4, 25 years, still digging in the stuff. And guess what? Here is what, from the point of view of the understanding that I have, there's absolutely no end to the stuff. There's no end to the stuff to dig in. So you need to be very careful. Emotional introspection is a must. Awareness of how certain impression causes an alliance which can sink deep into the system. And by virtue of the way consciousness functions, it cannot remain to the light of the waking state of consciousness. So I can sit down with all the transpersonal psychologists and clinical psychologists at once and show them how things work that they might not even imagine in their wildest imagination. Even if they're rooted in Carl Jung. Carl Jung was not a tantrika. Carl Jung was a very educated man, but did not become a Sufi master. Analogy giving. He did not become that what he studied. It's a big difference. And yet I held him in high esteem because of his sheer courage to bring this out into the open, to the academia. Back then, crazy biscuit. That what cannot be held by waking state of consciousness would have to go underground. So in other words, there's already this predisposition of anything that is not digested in the field of our experience is forced to be shoveled into the subconscious and into unconscious level. Then access is then become limited. Access is only either through the dream to some of it, and only if the one who dreams already given to some work, some kind of work. Because in the being in whom there is familiarity with the field of transcendence, this is a different kind of experience. I will explain this. A non-meditator dreams in the same way as a meditator. But in meditator, when the meditator dreams, he spews out the unprocessed in the form of a dream. It's a unique here quality that meditators have. So in other words, when meditator dreams of what can be heralded as nightmare or considered nightmare or something, it's a release of stress. Something that was not able to be released in either meditation or when processing certain experiences. But the duration of processing certain experiences is not that long. So therefore, culturally, in tribal cultures, there are days given, days. There are numbers are given when you have to process that. For example, the biggest emotional jolt is when we part with those we love, with dear to us. It's obvious. It doesn't need explanation why. It's a complex thing. Very human, but also it is rightly so. So remember this when one has to process that grief. This grief becomes the central job. Why? Because if that grief is not processed in a given moment in time, then that grief will not be processed. It will be pushed to the subtler dimension. It will be, like, as it were, not even swept under the carpet, because that's not really a strong enough analogy. It will go and seep deep into the unconscious, and we would not know why we're suffering. It will then start coming on the somatic level in the form of this or that. And in the most dramatic examples, it will manifest as tumors, as physical growth in the body. That's what essentially cancer is. Cancer manifests itself as a physical growth because unknown information cannot be processed, but it has to come to the surface somehow. Another reason for that is, of course, because at the level of the DNA, there's a missing key. There's a missing key, flat key. When you play piano keys, and if the old piano, sometimes you put, and it doesn't hit the note. In the same way, our DNA is a frequency, it's not a molecule. It's a pure sound. It's a sound vibration. So when that sound vibration begins to break down, it breaks down as RNA, the formation of the protein. This is where it becomes molecule. DNA itself is not a molecule. They say DNA molecule, but it's not a molecule yet. It's the sound which will give rise to a molecule. So within that sound, in the DNA, there's a range of sounds, literally as a music, as notes. And if there are, and what happens in the case of, in those in whom the predisposition is at high risk, is because certain breakdown took place. So the DNA does not transfer full information. It doesn't give all the notes which is required for the symphonic orchestration of the functioning of the nervous system. And that flat key, imagine if there's one, you may good piano player will still play something, even a Moonlight Sonata, with that numb, deaf key. Imagine two, already more difficult. And I'm not musician. Musicians should really tell me, right? Yeah, Paganini had all strings gone, right? And he, because they were cut, right? Remember the story? Jay, Paganini's strings were cut in the legend, and he played everything, the whole concerto on one string in the end. There was the story. Yeah, one piece he played on one string. But it's possible, you see? It's still possible, because even on one string you can hit the required notes. But in the piano you can't. So this is why the analogy is given. I came up with that analogy myself many years ago. Many, many years ago, as many as 25 years ago. And this numb sound, when it's repeatedly passed, at some point begins to form this what otherwise is not transmitted at the level of where the formation of the protein. So in other words, the possibility rises that anything can grow. Cells do not receive full information. It's not fully orchestrated. So that what is not fully orchestrated opens up for anything to come in. Anything, any cell can then grow. All of them work in unison. And suddenly there is this, we don't know what to do. And then that alien cell comes in now, because that becomes a possibility. But this is the technical picture, clinical picture. But how can that come? What will come? Why this particular cell start to grow? And that is all based on the information that has been pushed to the unconscious. It then manifests itself. And as it manifests itself, we can then begin to analyze, let's say, the statistics of why certain types of cancer is the most prevalent in this culture, among this group of people. And we can see that, we can actually see the pattern. So, that's why so much importance is to the release of stress and the ability of nervous system to process information, process experience. Many years ago I suggested, just as an example, that someone comes out of the battlefield, literally, out of the war zone, and may not require PTSD treatment. And someone comes out of the exchanges at the cashier with a heart attack. It's not the experience, but the way we process it, and the ability to process that experience, to metabolize that. And if it's not metabolized, the window is very short, because in waking state of consciousness, it cannot carry it. You see? It cannot carry it. It's extra weight. It's extra field of information which is not processed. Something needs to be done with it. At the level of the digestive system, it's very simple. Undigested food causes tremendous discomfort one way or another. Something needs to be done to it. Whatever the remedy there, it would have to go. But at the subtle level, we cannot just take these oils and, the stuff that like peppermint oil, like pepper oil, like all, this is like will cut through that. This flatulence, this burping, indigestion, it's like information that came with food is not being digested. The food is also information. And the information that came with the experience is not digested. We don't have drops for it. We don't have immediate remedies. The best remedy here, of course, is this kind of work, is this kind of methodology. Because it can act very fast, particularly if the stress is fresh, not old. But if it's old, it still can work on it. And this is what I'm witnessing. People have stresses pulled out of their system, which is decades old, lifetimes old. It never ceases to amaze me how it happens. But, of course, this is what the field does. In the field, it's a possibility, visceral possibility. Because the frequency of that field as it becomes to be, as it builds, on this build-up, no longer subject to these relative states of consciousness. It's no longer at the level of the waking state, which is the domain of the waking state of consciousness, right? It's the working of the senses at the disposal of the mind, the acuity. It incorporates and encompasses all of them, including the waking, the dreaming, the deep sleep, which are the expressions in turn of the subtle and the causal. It is the causal that is being here, now, accessed. The unconscious. That which, unfortunately, modern psychology has no access to. And really, those who worth their salt, they admit that. And I don't want to also for it to be sounded categorical here that, sometimes access to that what in the working on the shadows and can be helpful, can be useful. But it cannot be turned into methodology. This is what I argued with Almaz. It's a wrong premise to turn it into method. Method should always be up. Method is ascend. Method is to the light, embodiment, divinity, cosmos, the method. Method is not to go into what went wrong. You see? If the method is based on what went wrong, something is going to backfire sooner or later. By virtue of consciousness, we multiply anything we place our attention on, magnify it. And nothing can be compared with the magnifier of the awakened life force. That's what truly magnifies everything. So what really, really is great is that the professionals in the field like yourself directly go through the process. Because what we need is a revolution. Revolution, just as what Stanislav Grof and his wife, Christina, they proposed back then, it's as actual as ever. It's as relevant as ever. The spiritual emergency is en masse. En masse. It's treated culturally now. So,
it's at the root of all suffering.
yes.
That is the essential suffering of all humans, is the disconnection from source.
Yes. Well, yes, of course, it's that root cause of all suffering is disconnection. But it's not really disconnection. It's not really disconnection. In that set of reflections, I did my best to speak about this in terms of two principal waves, because this is what it is. Two principal waves, movements. The movement for that and outflowing, the movement of emission. It's that what flows over, spills over. This is the results, and this what we partake in. And that what is known as the counter movement, the movement of withdrawal. None of that. These are two major modalities in awareness. There is no disconnection. It's just one is the propensity to overflow into the external, externalizing out of itself, out of its plenitude. Another is internalizing, as it were, homecoming from the human perspective. But of course, it's very helpful for people who are stopped on their track, is that this suffering is due to your lack of connection to the source. Absolutely. But for those who already tread the path, different explanations are required, because it's not due to disconnection from the source. Disconnection from the source doesn't exist. So this is very important to bring as a reminder, so that nothing can be disconnected, because even the connection here is also subject to simply of the language, limitation of the language. So, well, in a way, this is where I'm kind of repeating myself. It's like we just really the scope of Indian philosophy is so all-encompassing. And it all-encompassing is not just, there is a reason for that, because it's uninterrupted investigation into the domain of consciousness for millennia. Which other culture? Please point me, and I'll go there, and I will do my best to find out. There's none. There's no other culture that had that turned into their raison d'être. So of course that because of that uninterrupted investigation into the domain of consciousness, it came up with such precise, elaborate, all-encompassing, detailed overview. And then one can pick and, choose. It's a perfect philosophical platform exists there for complete and utter renunciation, or complete and utter embodiment to the fullness. There are most extraordinary ways of soaking oneself in the devotion, that whole Bhakti movement. Of course, we can find all that. We can find that in Western culture. Of course we can, here and there. But these are isolated examples, often subjected to so many persecutions, so many, and in India, there are universities on the ways and how self-realization can be viewed. Doctorates. I mean, this is why, if someone wants to reinvent the wheel, let them do that. If someone wants to reinvent the bicycle, to me, it's a practicality, aspect of usability and practicality. I'm very practical by nature. Very practical. And of course, I delved into many other systems as well over the years, many, many different. So this, if we speak about disconnection from the source, with crystal clarity it shows at what point in that emission of awareness for the sake of its self-expression, when it becomes out of necessity to begin to conceal itself with the screen, so as then to enjoy the full show whilst munching popcorn. It's clear there, because otherwise it's not real. Why would consciousness fool itself? It has to be real. Suffering has to be real. Everything has to be real. So this is what feels like we can continue this as well. We can continue this conversation in terms of, because I'm also interested to know ways forward, how, because a lot of people are given to therapy, and sometimes they have to go through therapy. In many cases, the only thing is that's the only spirituality for people. For some people, that's the only spiritual ways, because it's jumping at a deep end. Not everyone can do that. So it definitely still fulfills that tremendous vacuum there. Vacuum of what? Vacuum born of living in a secular culture we have become. So we are tending to ourselves. It's like tending ourselves, like walking each other home, like Ramdas said, right? It's like it's a big theme, big topic. So hopefully there is this propensity where the different threads, different professions, different approaches begin to somehow see the value in working together, right? Particularly when it comes to what could be plainly spoken in terms of a balanced, happy, wholesome, integral life. So that we need to really move away from the pill. We need to move away from all these solutions of pathologizing what is natural. And so psychiatry and psychology are the first areas where that what Tantra has direct insight into should be their business, just like Carl Jung has suggested anyway. If not for Tantra and Carl Jung's interest into Tantra, it's like this. The late Carl Jung is not the archetypes. Jordan Peterson is wrong. He revels over Jung and archetypes. The late Jung is this. Late Jung, all interest in Kundalini, but he couldn't venture to go there. Something kind of like, obviously because he understood that it's not going to be studying it. It's going to be paying the price of becoming it. So therefore he left it at the level of the lectures. So